Okay, and take two.
Mr. and Madam Speaker, if you want to learn about the poor and help them out, be my guest. But what team government is going to argue is that purpose taking the form of tourism would be the worst channel to act upon your benign hopes of bettering the other half. Before I move on to the arguments of today's debate, let's set this debate up. Our government will not talk about individualistic accounts and how people will benignly visit it on slums on themselves. Rather, what we're going to talk about and set this debate up is slum tourism as an institution. Definitionally, slum tourism means touristic visits to urban areas of relative poverty. We're talking about places like Dharavi, Mumbai, India, favelas in Rio de Janeiro, Kiberas in Kenya, Cape Town, South Africa, Jakarta in Indonesia, New Haven in Yale. We'd like to further elaborate three important characteristics for the clarity of today's debate. Number one, slum tourism is mostly run by professional tourism companies, whether they eventually institutionalize and turn into one, or whether they start out by one. We posit that market participants aren't locals all the time. Second, they also operate under government oversight, whether it be Brazil's regulation in favela tourism, or government investment in clearances in Kibera, or simply benefiting from taxation. Thirdly, we say, whilst we do see slum tourism in Bronx in New York City, the vast majority are operating in developing countries that we will argue has either weak democratic mandate or poor human rights record. And for the definition of does more harm than good, noting that we don't have to provide a definition, what we'd like to hear from team opposition are not arguments about what slum tourism can be, and how that will be beneficial, but a defense of the voyeuristic exploitations happening in the very real world. Split. Number one, how it's morally repugnant. Second, how it's a terrible economic strategy. Third, how it hides the fundamental problem. First argument, how it's morally repugnant. Slum tourism can be an experiential account of destitute poverty happening in the worst of worlds. However, we're going to prove to you in this argument that A, your experience and knowledge of slums is vastly inaccurate and unrepresentative of the real world, and second, while acquiring that knowledge, you dehumanize the dignity of these people living in slums. Two specific points to prove this. Number one, how this is inaccurate. We say that this distorts the image due to market incentives prevalent in slums. Number one, as characterized in our setup, slum tourism doesn't operate in a vacuum. It interacts with market incentives to increase profit margins and government pressure to crack down on unsanitary conditions and improve city optics, such as places in Rio de Janeiro.
Sir.
As a result of all of this, no thank you, the slums present to people a sanitized and agreeable version of poverty rather than what actually happens in the real world. What we say is the example we want to give you is favelas, in which the Rio de Janeiro municipal government pacified favelas to make sure more tourists enter that region, to make it clean and to make it safe for these people to actually go to. Fundamentally skewing the reality that these favelas aren't the way that they normally should be. Secondly, we see situations, for example, in Jakarta, saying it completely ruins the regions to show a much more desperate and much more destitute form of poverty than what actually happens in the real world, because they want to show and give the shock factor to all these tourists. So why is this bad? This is bad because it makes tourists numb to how bad it actually is. And it also perpetrates a misunderstanding of the problem, which leads to the misunderstanding of the solution in slum tourism, which is fundamentally bad. Second part of this argument, how it's harmful. It dehumanizes the poor as commercial products, Madam Speaker and Mr. Speaker. Slum tourism cheapens the plight of the poor by making it a commercial product. But not just a product, but a product for the rich. Three reasons why. Number one, this makes poor people further reliant on the rich for sustenance, in which it perpetrates and which abrogates a power structure, a power dynamic structure in which the poor is directly reliant on the rich to actually make any kind of money, and we think slum tourism is a perfect example of this. Number two, it forces them to prostrate themselves and allow themselves to be a form of entertainment. For example, we see that many people say accounts about how they feel like animals in the zoo, and they see safari. And all these tourists are people who are visiting the safari. This strips away their humanity and their right to dignity and respect as equal to human beings. But the comparative here, Mr. and Madam Speaker, no thank you, is how is this better than pure neglect? 3 reasons why it's better than neglect. Number 1, because comparatively it's not pure neglect. People who visit slums are the ones who are actively interested in the plight of the poor and the reality of poverty, which is why they seeked out these slums in the first instance. The relevant comparison would be these people spending their $30 on, for example, institutions like UNICEF, rather than spending it on slum tourism for professional tour guides and factory-made souvenirs. Second reason why it's better than neglect. There is no actual tangible benefit by allowing people to tour and see those who are financially constrained, because poverty itself is already a known global issue, so it's just like a tokenistic benefit. Number 3, even if it is, we would rather have you not do anything than create problems in slums such as dehumanization or economic harms, as we prove later on. Second argument, big argument, is terrible economic strategy. The simplistic logic that we'd rather not hear from opposition is just because you throw a bag of money at the poor that they will suddenly improve their lives. Similarly, we won't attempt to argue that revenue and donation to these regions will never benefit their lives. Both will happen sometimes. In this argument, government will argue that the comparative, that on the aggregate the curve skews toward being not beneficial, and how even when benefits accrue towards the slum dwellers, they come with structural maladies in the long run. First argument, let's argue the short run. We are willing to bite the bullet by virtue of being a popular business. Slum tourism generates cash profit. That's a given in this debate. But we do contest the idea that the money ends up benefiting the poor of slum community. There are a host of reasons why this is true. I'll give you 4. Number 1, economic gains are necessarily transient, Madam Speaker. We see the most popular times in which slum tourism is popular in the region is, for example, in situations like Christmas and Thanksgiving. 2 occasions in which people take on this impulsive altruism to visit those situations. We see that when tourism concerns spoke to 25 residents in Rosinha about their view of the possible tourism-related benefits, many people, the most common answer was that the benefits are none. But also secondly, as characterized before, foreign companies like the French company slated to complete the construction of a $300 million cable car system over Rosinha are actually the ones who are making the money and actually the ones who are investing in these regions. This is because infrastructure necessary to bring in these people from other countries are non-existent in the people living in slums. We see that many times that the people who are making the money are prop shops, internet marketing, and transportation, and these resources are not accessible. Yes, ma'am.
Don't you believe that exposure of slums for the tourists will actually allow sanitary conditions to be elevated in the region?
What we say is that that exposure is inaccurate, as I explained in my first argument. The exposure that you have to slum isn't the real world slums, but rather a pacified version that the government wants you to believe. Second reason why it's bad is because governments also tend to take care of this business, like the example of Rio de Janeiro, but also even when it's the locals earning the money, profit is concentrated towards the youngest, wealthiest, and most skilled workforce within the slum. And therefore it doesn't go to the people who need it the most. Why is this bad? Because even when those people get the money and have the ability to upscale and have upward mobility, these people leave the slums. And therefore the exact problem of slums will never better unless you actually put structural improvements to that region. Second argument of long run. We would like to question the sustainability of this economic framework as a whole. It is a myth that slum tourism can be used as a development tool. Why? Number 1, if you're earning money because you're poor, you don't have any incentive or claim at any other productive economic opportunity. Also, you are incentivized to be poor because that's what brings you the cash. But also second, it breeds dependence. What leads to upward mobility isn't $10 bills invested in these regions, but industries and stable jobs. Recognize, Madam Speaker, that tourism-dependent economic strategy is an inferior one. It's necessarily dependent upon factors that you have no control over. Also, it has big boom and bust cycles by nature, and therefore creates cyclical unemployment, and also harms the perception of the country, and for all those reasons I'm extremely proud to oppose.
Proposition tried to ban opposition from ever debating by saying that this debate is not about what slum tourism can be in the future. We wholly reject that notion. This debate is all about what slum tourism can be in the future. Slum tourism, although it has its origins in the 17th and 18th centuries, is currently a very new industry in its current form. Because we can't evaluate its current progress so far, because it is a new industry, we can't say that what happens now is all that it can be. In fact, opposition is going to look to the future and see what kind of benefits people in slums experiencing what's actually going on is going to provide for these slums in the future. After all, opposition is mostly focused, if not entirely focused, on making these slums a better place. We have no intention whatsoever in continuing this industry, and we accept that this in continuation will be wholly non-beneficial for the nation. We're simply going to solve that problem through the means of exposure. We are opposition standing under the value of exposure, ladies and gentlemen. We believe that we can solve negligence through exposure, and that slums in their very nature are defined by a lack of attention by the government. So the big question for opposition is, how are we going to bring that deserved attention to these slums? How are we going to make sure that the government, who will try to turn a blind eye on these slums because it's embarrassing for their country to have them, make sure that they care? We believe that the answer is in tourists.
Sir.
People who come from outside, people who have money, people who can actually invest in those slums, and people who the government is not neglecting. These people are practically the only people that are going to enter these slums that the government actively cares about. And through turning that point of attention to the places that deserve attention but are not getting any, opposition seeks to solve this perennial problem for slums once and for all. Of course, before I explain my two arguments, the first argument is going to be about the nature of slums and exposure. The second, I'm going to talk about what slum tourism exactly is. The characterization will happen here. And my second speaker is going to come up and talk about the economic benefits, the relation between slum tourism and how the community will become self-sustaining, autonomous. We are not, as opposition, willing to get these donations forever. We believe that donations can happen, but on a governmental level and on a civilian level, on these two pedestals, slum tourism will be able to bring these communities back into life. They will be able to reintegrate them. But of course, since they talk about the economic aspect in their Prime Minister's speech, I will have to lightly touch upon why they are wrong. Before I explain on to my first argument, I'm going to rebut what they said in the Prime Minister's speech. They said it's the worst channel to help because it's an institutionalized way of turning people into forms of entertainment. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, it's not right to say that these people are going for entertainment. As I will explain in my second argument, the very characterization of these slum tourists who would rather visit a dilapidated place is not because they want to enjoy it, it's because they believe that there is a certain inherent value. As they said in the final part of their Prime Minister's speech, the only people willing to visit here are people with a strong motivation that is based on curiosity. We challenge the proposition to come up here and prove why slum tourism is different from any other tourism if it's based on the same question of curiosity. Just because it has a different answer for the same question doesn't mean that you can deny these people access to the outside world. It doesn't mean that you cannot simply strike up negotiation between the government and the slums. Now, ladies and gentlemen, they also explained in their first argument about the experience of slums, that it's an inaccurate depiction. It doesn't operate in a vacuum, they said. However, they also here conceded that it will improve city dynamics. Opposition is not concerned about how these city dynamics become better. As long as they become better and improve for the residents, that is going to be a benefit for the community itself. Maybe the tourists will bring it in, but isn't that exactly what opposition is trying to do? The government doesn't care about slums. We accept that. It's a sad reality. But they do care about tourists. When the Brazilian government imposes security regulations and police on favelas, doesn't the favela become a safer place for people because gangs are chased away? Please sit down, sir. During the Brazilian World Cup, these slums became more secure places. It is a known fact that attention from the outside world does make these slums better places.
Sir?
Please sit down, sir. In the second argument, they said that it dehumanizes the poor. But it's not dehumanizing the poor, ladies and gentlemen. These people don't think of themselves as a mode of entertainment. Out of 800,000 residents in the Kaibiria slum, which is the largest in the world, there's an 83.9% consensus that it's beneficial to improving life quality. We believe that the slum people say that this is inherently beneficial to their quality of life. Proposition should not be coming up here and making assumptions about what is good or bad. Finally, about it being a bad economic strategy. Although this is going to be explained in our third argument, it's not simply a bad economic strategy because it doesn't go directly to the people. What we're saying is that this indirect benefit will increase security, it will increase life conditions, and that eventually these people will adapt these habits to become autonomously self-reliant. On to our first argument, about the nature of slums and exposure. Here, we're going to explain two subpoints. Number one, the basic nature of slums, about how there's a structural problem and a systematic failure. The second, about how exposure solves such problems. On to the first sub-argument. It's neglected by their own government, ladies and gentlemen. I made this clear in my introduction. The residents of their slum are politically weak or inactive. They're not aware of their political rights, and they're not aware of the mechanisms in which to exercise them. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, it's a wide spectrum. It's not a homogeneous environment. There are so many aspects to the slums that the proposition is not considering at all. The most important of which could be societal structural issues and their economic status. So, in South Africa, for example, they're the examples of the remnants of apartheid and colonialism. And in other countries, it's quite similar. We have to concede here that they're not supposed to present a homogeneous image of poverty. So far, they talked about UNICEF, but we reject that notion as well. UNICEF presents a skewed notion of poverty just to increase their donations, ladies and gentlemen. That's what we call the African prejudice. We believe Africa to be mostly a barren land full of swollen abdomens. And actually, when you visit Nairobi, Kenya, you have so many other things that are related to our industrial development. We want to present something about poverty that is not skewed, something that is not homogeneous. To the second subpoint, about how exposure solves such problems. Now, this is the important part. Infrastructure and input that tourism brings in ultimately produces positive externalities. As they conceded, and I backed up, it increases security and brings basic infrastructure to tourism. It's because these companies, although sometimes they act out of self-interest, what they do to make tourism better ultimately brings better structure so that these tourists can become better. Please sit down, sir. Ultimately, they also become aware of the specific and varying problems. We believe, as I said, attention is crucial to developing these environments, ladies and gentlemen. If you are going to neglect and cut off slums from the society, then you're not providing any sort of awareness whatsoever. Proposition will have to come up and fulfill its burden of saying, why cutting it off will do it better good.
Sure.
Now, why don't you explain that?
Engage with the argument that clearing out slums doesn't mean just making it clean, it means evicting house owners and making sure that all the people who are dirty living in there don't live there anymore. Engage with that argument.
Can we have an example of how the slums were actively evicted just to meet the demands of slum tourists, ladies and gentlemen? Mostly this happened because of development plans, and they were provided compensation in some other areas. This happened in Rocinha in Brazil and Rio de Janeiro, and also happened in the slums in South Africa. When we debated last year in South Africa, we debated in a slum, or they debated in a slum. And it was... On to the second argument, about the nature of slum tourism. Now this is important. Who actually engages in slum tourism? They believe that slum tourists are sadistic people who feed off the malnourishment and the disbenefits of people in poverty. This is not true. A study done by the University of Pennsylvania shows that the people who go to visit these slum tours are not motivated by anything other than simple curiosity about the culture and lives of people in a different situation. I want them to respond to that. Second, about slum tourism companies. We're not simply going to say here, we're not simply going to stand up here and say that slum tourism companies are always motivated by this nice need to help these people. This is inherently not true. But first, there are companies that do this, an overwhelming majority in fact. For example, the Mazatlan Church in Mexico seeks community service along with slum tourism. Other examples are the Dharavi slum tours, which donate 80% of their profits to helping these slums. But third, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to challenge with this very analysis that the motives of these people are important. Sure, the motives of these people may be in question. They may be morally decrepit people, but that doesn't matter when you are exposing to them something so dilapidated and so morally convicting that you may be able to change them. Ultimately, they're not doing anything that's different from the status quo. These people will be reading UNICEF pamphlets and throwing them into the trash can or into the campfire because they don't regard it as necessary things, because they identify them as morally decrepit people. But when you show them a different reality, that is what it becomes different, ladies and gentlemen, because to see for oneself is worth all the books of travel. Thank you.
So you're walking the wrong way. There you go.
The reason why we don't think slum tourism is a necessary evil is because tourism itself isn't necessary, Mr. Speaker. Especially when you don't know and you just want to know poverty, which is pretty much something that is globally well known, and you can just see, you can know about poverty without going to these places. The reason why it's not a necessary evil but simple evil is because we think it's not just uncomfortable but morally repugnant to see people in bright holiday t-shirts looking at profound misery and thinking that they're learning something and thinking that they're learning about poverty. So what I'm going to do as Deputy Prime Minister is, first of all, I'm going to go through their entire case and their entire stance and why this is wrong. And we're going to explain our third argument why this is actually hiding the fundamental problem. So the first thing that Changju said when he came up to the podium is that we're talking about like this debate is all about what slum tourism is going to be like in the future. We think that this is a good soundbite, but it goes against the entire stance because, first of all, we think the problems that we mentioned are things that are inherent in the mechanism of slum tourism itself. The problem is the people who are going there because they are curious and people who are going there because they want to learn will actually, this will only be sustained by the fact that they will somehow have to somehow take photos and take the dignity away from these people, that somehow they'll try to look at these children scuttling around and want to see these children in action and children doing like poor stuff and like begging to them. This is something that this is something that is inherently going to exist in slum tourism. We think it's an inherent problem, and this is what we're here to debate, not about like how it can be fixed in the future. So his first argument, what he said to our first argument was that it's not morally repugnant because first of all, these people don't think of themselves as they're losing dignity. So what I want to firstly say to that is that we can't really debate this on statistics, on what people say that like 80% say that I don't really feel as if I'm like taking my dignity away. Because we think that we have other statistics showing that people in other areas are saying that they feel like animals in zoos. What we're saying is that the analysis is important. The analysis is that when these people who are rich, who afford to like take plane tickets to go to these exotic places and see these people in profound misery, we think that something is definitely wrong with that. We think that something's definitely wrong when these people are expecting the people in those slum areas to act differently from themselves, to act in a state of poverty, things that they haven't known before, things that they haven't experienced before. We think that is gross. But secondly, we think that the reason why slum tourism especially is more like problematic morally is because when you go to places for tourism because of like historical reasons or because you want to see like some sort of palace or you want to see some sort of building, we think that's fine. But the reason why this is wrong is because you're expecting these people to display their profound misery. And we think that is fundamentally different from just going to places because of some sort of building and some historical or cultural reason. The second refutation they said to this was that there is a government burden to clean these places up. So what we want to first say is that there is complete difference between just cleaning the slums up and managing some sort of like a sanity level for these tourists to not be hurt, and clearing the slums to actually make these places livable. Because we think that there is a fundamental reason why the United Nations says that slums are unique. They're not just places of poverty. Slums are places where you are denied the basic rights to live, where you are denied the basic access to water. We think that it's a matter of survival, and we think that it's wrong for the government to leave these there. We think that it's the government's duty to clear these slums up and evoke these people to places where they are livable. The problem of slum tourism is you give the government an excuse to actually like let these slums to exist, and that is the problem that we're trying to say. It's not just a problem of like cleaning up more trash on the streets. They talked about how it's actually like they go because not of entertainment but because of curiosity. So look, I don't get the difference between like entertainment and curiosity, because I think that most of the reason why you go to something because you're entertained is because you don't know that, and that itself is curiosity. But what we're saying is that, like you said, if these people are people who are strongly motivated anyway, they don't have to go there to be enlightened that there is poverty around in the world. Probably the reason why they go there on places on times like Christmas is because they think that they're probably motivated, they know about poverty, and they want to go there. If they're motivated, they're not. They're not going to throw away their UNICEF pamphlets away like you talk about. They can actually like donate money to these places, and that is the comparative that we want to debate in this debate. So their first argument was basically about the nature of slums. And he talks about how, look, we're going to like show a diversity of images, and this is going to be really, really important. So first of all, we think that this completely drops our entire argument about how the exposure itself is really skewed. How the exposure is related, like inherently related to market incentives, and it highlights the things that people are like enlightened and interested in. It's not showing the diverse nature and the diverse reality of these places anyway. But secondly, he talks about that this is the only way that you're going to gain awareness of poverty, right? First of all, I think we've like pretty much rebutted this. But secondly, we don't think that you can actually learn something meaningful when you're not really interacting with the people in the slums, and your life is not an intersection, but it's a parallel, right? You cannot really experience these like poor areas, because what you're doing basically, the like current form of like slum tourism is you're building like you're building like wait. You're building like the things that you do cable cars. You're building cable cars to say these slums, we think that like that itself reflects symbolically how these people are not really interacting with the poverty situation on feet, but are just learning it and trying to like see it like on off ground, and that's not interaction. We think that's a parallel. Before I go on, sure.
How is homogeneous portrayal of poverty, like UNICEF does, in terms of the African prejudice that the first speaker talked about, allow our society to interact with these people, allow for the government to care about this?
So first of all, I'm not saying that we agree with the media perception that UNICEF builds around Africans. Secondly, I'm saying what the reason why I mentioned UNICEF was a form of saying that you should actually give tangible benefits to these people through like donated means or like through building stuff there and through like building infrastructure. Like no, we're not talking about how UNICEF like dictates Africans. You talked about how like some tourists, I don't even know, there's some tourist like institutions are really good and they're really like decent. So first of all, we don't think that you've proven in your entire case. You said that you do this, but you won't. So we think if you want the judge to throw something at you, you don't. But you said that you're going to prove why you're going to be like self-sustaining. We think that even like good and being like even like good tourist groups still make these people rely on these huge institutions, and that is inherently bad. But secondly, we tell you that you don't know. You don't know as people whether to choose between these good tourist groups and bad tourist groups, because all the tourist groups will market and advertise that they will help the poor in some certain way. So there's no like choice that these people will make. Third of all, even if some of the money is going to the people, we tell you that this is going in disproportionate means. The only people that are profiting from the slum tourism industry are probably the people who like make lazy souvenirs. We don't think that it goes to the entire population of that slum area anyway. Our third argument, very briefly, is about why this hides a fundamental problem. So on a domestic and national level, Madam Speaker, we think that the governments are granted the excuse for cleaning up slums. You asked me to give me examples, so here it goes. So in Kenya in 2009, there was a slum clearance in Kiberia. So the government was mandated to clear all of these slums except for that very road where the tourists visited the most. We think that this is gross. We think that this it gives excuse to the government, and that's really bad because it's hiding the fundamental problem. We also think that it gives them the excuse to not do anything to deliver the provision of basic goods and installing the baseline living standards, like for example in Indonesia, Jakarta. Internationally, Mr. Speaker, we think that what did you say here, Chumpyo? Internationally. So, some experts have been exploiting the facts and by saying that this is the largest slum in Africa, in Kibera, for example, and we think that it turns out to be a very big lie. So, not even the combined population living in all of Kenya's slums comes anything close to the largest slum in Africa. And according to these sentences, which are really wrong, so basically, this argument is that internationally we're hiding the problem. We're saying that these are the biggest slums and these are the issues, and there's actually poor places where the international society actually has to put more attention to. This harms the image argument that they're talking about. So for these reasons, extremely proud to propose motion stands. Thank you very much. I didn't get the third argument.
Because you didn't beat it beforehand.
Teamwork. All right, next speaker. What has it?
Mr. Madam Speaker, in debating today's motion of whether slum tourism does more harm than good, opposition believes we shouldn't be only talking about what happened in the past. We should also be talking about what's happening in the present. More than that, we should also be talking about the trend and norm that has been created between the past and the present. Therefore, we should be also talking about what's likely to happen in the future and what is happening from the present to the future. In that retrospect, Team Opposition believes, under the idea of exposure, and under the idea that exposure causes real action and real benefits, we Team Opposition believe we see a great need to oppose today's motion. Today, as a second speaker from Team Opposition, I'm going to be talking about the economic benefits that slum tourism brings to the residents of slums. I'm also going to talk about how slum tourism itself brings in and facilitates structural social development for these regions, something that our government has been able to do, something that our society has been neglecting in the past. But before I deliver such arguments as the opposition second speaker, I'll briefly talk about the refutations and deliver rebuttals towards the proposition. I have mostly 3 points of refutation. First is about the idea of poverty and how our society is already aware and accurately portraying the realistic portrayal of these slum regions. Second refutation is going to be about the government excuse to exist or to maintain these slums. And the third refutation is going to be about their dehumanizing dignity part, how it actually sacrifices the moral integrity of the residents of the slums. So first of all, how poverty is well known. From our first speaker, we already told you how poverty and the portrayal of poverty in conventional media is not accurate and is skewed in itself. Now the other proposition, they don't really understand why this is happening in the first place. So I'll explain it once more. In today's status quo, In status quo, poverty is portrayed in a very homogeneous method through pamphlets of the UNICEF, through posters, and through statistics. The reason why this is so important is because depending on individual slums, the social structure of these individual slums differ. The academic status of these individual slums differ. Poverty in itself is not a homogeneous method or a portrayal that can be depicted in a single factor simply by showing a poor African kid. It depends on the society, it depends on the progress and the history of that society. That's why we believe in the status quo. The media is not able to know, thank you sir, accurately portray why these slums are slums in the first place. The only reason, the only method for the people to realize what's actually happening in these places is for them to go into these places, for them to realize the history and the lifestyles that the residents of the slums have to face every single day. That's why we believe, because slum in itself is so diverse in its spectrum that our media fails to portray and characterize accurately to our society, only slum tourism provides that benefit for individuals who out of their self-will choose to participate in slum tourism. So thank you, ma'am. Second important refutations about the argument about how the government has an excuse to exist or to maintain the slums. First of all, the reason why the slums are maintained as slums in the first place is because of social neglect. It's because the government denies and neglects the existence of the slums. The government has no necessity to care about these individuals. The government is not willing to allocate much of their budget. The government is not willing to allocate much of their policy making for these minorities. This is especially worse in the status quo because usually residents of slums are politically inactive or politically weak individuals. In most characteristics, they're not aware of their political or human rights. They're not aware of the mechanisms to exercise their rights, and therefore they're not able to exercise their rights properly as residents of slums. We team opposition believe this is a structural problem that has to be solved. Only in order to address the political and human rights of these individuals, that can only happen when slum tourists or citizens and civilians of our society, politically active members, go in, realize what's happening, and portray that idea in their own political votes, portray that idea when they go back to home. We believe that's how exposure causes for social action towards these slum residents. Because in the status quo, no thank you ma'am, these are individuals that are politically inactive or not aware of their mechanisms, therefore society does that job for them because of slum tourism, because we now know what the government is doing, we now know what the government has not been doing for these individuals. Therefore, at the end of the day, no, thank you, ma'am. If slum tourism is maintained and has been maintaining, that's the only way for the government to not neglect these individuals. Now the government has a responsibility and a duty to care, because there is social consensus that the government has to care. Third point of our reputation is about the dehumanizing dignity aspect. Now, first, we told you in our second argument analysis that these are individuals who are not morally repugnant individuals, who are morally distorted individuals that use misery as entertainment. We told you these are individuals with a genuine curiosity, and more important, these are individuals who have a general will to care and to act on behalf of these individuals. That's exactly the reason why we believe slum tourism creates a unique benefit for these individuals. In a world without slum tourism, for example, we believe these morally repugnant individuals would have done the same. They would have gone to poor regions and lacked and leached and exploited upon the lack of human rights and lack of economic benefits of these poor regions anyway. Slum tourism allows a systematic and institutionalized level of a tourism organization, or our society as a whole, even people who do not care in the past, even people who are not so aware of what poverty actually meant for these people now are aware, therefore have an incentive to care. Also, we believe there's an increasing trend in our status quo. Perhaps in the early stages of slum tourism, these individuals took photographs without even asking for permission of these individuals. Maybe in the early stages, these individuals actually sacrificed the integrity of the local residents. That's why in the status quo we see a change in the ways, change in the mechanisms in which how some slum tourists actually perceive these residents. We see a change that is ongoing in the status quo as to how these slum tourist institutions undergo their slums. For example, in recent years, now these slum tourists advise their tourists not to take photographs because it might dehumanize the integrity of the residents. There's an ongoing trend that is being created in our society because the society is not aware of the problems that slum tourism actually may create. It is not aware of the side effects that it has created in the past. Therefore, we do make policies, we do amend situations, and natural change is happening to facilitate the residents and the moral integrity of the residents of the slum. With that, I'd like to move on to talking about the third argument about economic benefits. Now it facilitates trade. Four levels of analysis. First, direct economic transaction is allowed. Second, more community-based and giving back to the local community is happening. Third, charitable donations and actual care is happening. Fourth, there's more making of policy for these individuals. First, direct economic transaction is happening in the status quo, in two aspects also. First of all, slum tourism forms new economic market. It forms a new market and a new infrastructure, therefore it escalates the quality of life for the resident of the slum. We all know the broken window theory. Because of this theory, slum tourism allows for an incentive to work, allows for an incentive to clean up the environment in which slum residents live. It actually makes these slum residents more of an more active economic entity in and out by themselves. Why is this so beneficial for them? Because we believe this not only ends at that level, it actually brings in more foreign investors. Seoul or London, for example, was a slum that was developed because individuals had more of an incentive to care about the region. Therefore, foreign investors came in, invested in that region. The second, more importantly, it actually creates a community base or giving back to the local communities. We talked about in the first speaker how reality tours, for example, actually provides 80% of their post-tax profits from the tours to their partner. Other non-governmental organizations that reality gives actually provides education and training for young women in the slums as well as other projects from slum dwellers. This movement is actually facilitated by the social consensus and social will because now after slum tourism has been a norm for our society, more people are aware, more people care, and more people ask for non-governmental organizations to act on behalf of slum tourism. This giving back to local community is facilitated by more social consensus that has been formed by slum tourism. Third, we see an increase in charitable donations that is actually going directly into these slums. And fourth, we see more making of policies, more making of economic policies and allocation of budget for the residents of the slums. Because now our society is aware, now our society has to care, and also because our society cares, the government also has to care. In a world without slum tourism, slums have been slums. But in a world of slum tourism, slums are transforming into a social development status. We believe this is a benefit for them. Therefore, we're very proud to oppose them.
What was that?
She went to the restroom.
Oh,
She was so intimidated by your analysis that she just left. Good job.
그러니까. 이렇게 되면 저기서 얘기하면 it's because of the tourist people.
Where'd she go? Restroom.
She was like so like she was like what was that?
Stitch, you're gonna need to stand up.
데스크에 좀.
Oh my god.
진짜
So bad.
진짜 나빴다.
Yes, in the past, slums have been slums. But the problem is, if we continue to have slum tourism, slums need to be slums in the future. And this is why it's not only that slums need to be slums, we think the slums have to be the worst that they can ever be. The worst slums. To show these people, to expose them to, poverty and doing poor things. We need to, because of that, we don't think that slum tourism is necessary. So I have 3 clashes in today's debate. Number 1, what is slum tourism? Number 2, is it necessary? And number 3, I'm going to analyze the social implications on an individual and a social level. So starting with number 1, what exactly is slum tourism? As someone who's been living on Jeju Island, people constantly asking me, so for food, do you eat tangerines? Do you ride horses? So when I try to tell them, no, that's not the case, come to Jeju, we find out that's not the case, these people come and fly to Jeju, and then they eat something like pork, the black pork and whatnot. So you do actually eat tangerines because they've only been there for 1 week. They don't actually know what the problem is. When they actually come to my island and show them I don't eat tangerines. You think that in that case, just because you go there for 1 week and say, oh, these people are so poor, they're not going to be actually experiencing or understanding that problem. So I think that there's a clear difference between understanding something and being exposed to something. And we clearly think, no, thank you, that's kind of an analysis that the opposition side has never given us. So exactly what we've told you today, that these slums are institutions. We've told you in the first speech, it's a professional institution where we need to always show them the bad aspects of these slums. Because it's going to be quite kind of weird if you go to slums and people are drinking tea. You're not going to think, "Where's my slums?" You know, you're going to ask for those things that are happening in those slums itself. So we always have to show them the worst reality, and therefore we think that this slum tourism is so evil. The opposition, yes, they told us that, you know, and these and UN groups, you know, they have to show them through pamphlets and whatnot, and therefore we need slum tourists. But that's the same thing that's happening in slum tourism, ladies and gentlemen. We show them the worst reality to extract attention from these tourists, to give them that attention saying, "Aw, they're poor, we need to help them." This is the kind of attention we want. We're not going to say, slum tourism isn't that bad, slums are not that bad. That's not the attention that we want. So therefore, we're only showing them the worst reality that exists within these slums. And that's why we say that this is problematic in the first place. So we think because they have to stay as slums, I'll take you in a moment, sir, because they always have to be slums later on in the future is why that there is a clear problem. Yes, sir.
Because of social consensus that has been formed by exposure, governments and these tourist organizations can no longer maintain and no longer exploit upon the lack of political action.
So if there's actually a social consensus, why do you need to experience it in the first place? If you actually know the problems that are happening in these slums, do you really need to go and touch these people and say, "You're poor"? See, you can't do that. That's why we think that that's not necessary. We think that if there is, yes, a social consensus saying that these slums are bad, there is poverty in those places, therefore we need to help them, why do you have to strip them of their dignity and look at them for as long as you can? We don't think that's necessary, and therefore we think, you know, these are slums. They're not slums in pictures, and therefore we think that there was an incomplete characterization of slums from the opposition side. So we take that clash off. So second of all, is it necessary? Our second speaker told you in today's debate that it's not a necessary evil, it's just evil. Because we've clearly shown you in debate it's not actually necessary. They've told you about realizing history, they told you about the diverse spectrums, but clearly, like their POI stated, if there is a social consensus that this place is bad, it needs helping, why do you need to go there? Why do you need to touch these people? Okay, photos aren't allowed, we can still look at them like they're zoo animals. That's not the case. We think we're just stripping them of their dignity of what we already know. And we think this is a clear problem. This is an evil. It's morally repugnant, ladies and gentlemen. Also, let's look at the politically active members and politically inactive members. What we think about the politically inactive members is that they're just going there for curiosity. We agree with the opposition. But we think that curiosity is a kind of entertainment. We're not going to go, "Oh, I'm curious." We're going to go and say, "Oh, I'm curious." We think that there's a difference between, you know, going there, you're entertained. You're not having fun in general. You're not going to go popping party bombs there. But in that case, you're still being entertained because you're learning something from the process. But we don't think that itself is necessary. You can look at these pamphlets. You can look in the internet and see what the problems are. You don't necessarily have to go there. If the opposition, I'll take you in a moment, sir, if the opposition is so clear on experience, do you have to know if a fire hurts by putting your hand in the fire? Yes, sir.
If we agree that both pamphlets and experience are skewed, what do you think the value stands in personal experience?
We think the problem of being skewed is that you actually go to these people and ask them, "Are you skewed?" That's the problem. We think if it's a pamphlet thing, if they understand why it's a problem, then it's all right because you're not harming anyone in general. But if you're going to these places and seeing them and thinking that this is the problem, we think that there's a clear problem because it's an individual, you know, action. You're going to these people and showing them, making them lose their dignity. And therefore we think it's a clearly different process. So in general, we don't think it's necessary for these politically inactive members to go to these slums. So, no, thank you, sir. For these politically active members, I think I'm very concerned for my society if the politically active members do actually have to look at them and say, "Oh, we need to help these people." We think, well, they'll have that discretion to think that there is a problem going on in this society, there is a problem going on in these slums, and therefore we need to change it. Why do these politically active members have to go and actually experience these things is my question. Is it that they don't believe this is happening? We don't think this is the case. So we think that these politically active members have to have that discretion themselves. They need to know that they need to recognize that these people also have dignity. I think that's enough to ask for these politically active members if they're supposed to be politically leading our country. So in this case, we'd say that it isn't necessary. It's just morally repugnant. No, thank you, sir. We're just doing something that isn't necessary and it's going to harm the other people in the long term. So we don't think it's necessary. Last class, about the social implications. Sit down, sir. We're going to talk about this in an individual and a social level. So in today's debate, it was about whether the slum tourism does more harm than good. We don't think that was a comparative analysis from the opposition side. They just said, oh, it's good, it's good, it's good. But tell me why that good is more harmful or more is better than being the bad effects that happen in that society. And we've clearly shown you that analysis between it's doing more harm than good. Okay, we may some money may come from that in the short term, but in the long term and the short term, we told you that it's not the case. It's going to be economically disadvantaged to these people, and we told you that this is going to be harmful in the long run. So on the individual level, we're making these people commercial products. We're looking at them and saying, you need to act in a certain way. Why? Because it's a tourist activity. You're not going to these slums and saying, oh, I've come across the slum. Let's look at what happens. You're saying, this is a slum. No, thank you. This is how the zoo animal acts, and this is what they're doing. And that's why we need to help them. There's a clear difference between two things, as just running into a slum just accidentally and saying, this is a slum. Let's look at what happens here. So in this case, you're making that individual a commercial product, and we don't think it's right for a person to be dehumanized and their dignity stripped away in that case. Maybe they want it in the short term because they want an extra couple of bucks, but that's not the case. If you want them to get out of this poverty zone in the long run, this is not the way to go. And our first speaker and second speaker clearly told you that economically, it's not going to go in the way that the opposition side has said. On a social level, I find it really problematic that the community giving back has to necessitate someone experiencing that problem for themselves, especially when they're only going to be there for a week, or not even a week, a day or a few hours. We don't think that that kind of understanding or education will suddenly come from one visit. We don't think it's going to be it's a sad problem. They're going to have a sad moment for a couple of minutes, and then they're just going to go home. Of course, the more politically active members of society may have some type of vision, but we clearly stated to you that it isn't a necessary thing to do to go to these tourist areas and then get that feeling of hardship or whatnot. Like I said before, we don't think that understanding equals experiencing and exposure. We think that understanding comes on a more fundamental level where you actually understand the problem. It doesn't go from poking other people and doing anything like that. So in general, we say that I live in Jeju, I don't only eat tangerines. And this is probably how some people in the slums feel like too. If you go for a week and you completely understand their problems, that's not the case. And that's why we think it's not necessary, it does more harm than good, and therefore we strongly beg to propose. Thank you.
Good job.
The passive version that is only shown to people. 실력이 계속 그렇게
Go for it.
나까지 간댔거든요.
The wonderful third speaker of Team Proposition, her first introduction was slums need to be slums. Unless Team Proposition was so scared of Team Opposition's case that they had to make a case shift in the middle of the debate, we don't necessarily think that Team Proposition is being consistent throughout the debate. So let's see what exactly was the inconsistency and the problem in Team Proposition, right? So the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister told you that these slum residents will have to evict from the slums, and that is also going to be the problem. However, the Team Proposition's third speaker came up to us and said that, you know what, actually, some people will be forced to become slums. We don't necessarily think that two things can exist at the same time. But more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, we don't think that these slums will stay as slums, because what slum tourism will actually do is not make people dependent on slum tourism by itself. In fact, what it's actually going to do is spark a change and actually give and confer them with a political voice they have never been able to be given in the previous stages. And so with that clear, I want to move on to the three clashes that have been identified in this debate. Firstly, the slum tourists. How exactly these slum tourists view the slums, and how exactly these people make changes in the slums. Second, the corporations and the government incentive, because Team Proposition was very obsessed with the idea that these people are so exploiting, these people are so corrupt, it's going to actually backfire at the end of the day. Third clash, residents of the slums. We think that this last clash is actually fundamentally the most important clash in this debate, because what Team Opposition's value was in order to enhance the lifestyle of the residents of the slums at the end of the day. So let's move on to the first clash, which is about slum tourists. Now the first thing, the Prime Minister came up to the podium and characterized these tourists as people who are entertainers, because they're people that go into slums just for entertainment. We don't necessarily think that that is actually true. Ladies and gentlemen, if I were to take a break off from debate, I would actually go to Hawaii, not slums, right? But the fundamental incentive of these slum tourists to go into slums is because they were curious enough to know and curious enough to indulge in themselves to the exposure of slums. We think that incentive is fundamental to the slum tourists. Now the second point that we've heard from Team Proposition on this slum tourist itself, right? So Now they told us that firstly that there's not enough exposure in the status quo. Now this was a stat that Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister continue to say there's not enough exposure because she gave us examples about cable cars, right? And then the third speaker came up to you and said, actually, you're actually dehumanizing these people because people are going in and jeering at these people. We don't see how these two things can actually coexist at the same time. Ladies and gentlemen, what we do think and what we want to pose as a question to team proposition is that we don't think dehumanizing is an integral part of slum tourism and spaces. Because what slum tourism is, it's not going in and jeering at other people and saying that, oh my gosh, these people are so poor. Oh my gosh, no, that is not what is happening in slum tourism. What is actually happening is that these people have an incentive to know more about the poor people. And as my leader of opposition and deputy leader of opposition told you, these people have a motive, and a fundamental motive to give more money to these people, to fund these people. We think that is the motivation, that is the fundamental incentive of slum tourism, not laughing at other people. Let's move on to our second clash, which is about the corporations and government incentive. Now, firstly, they told us that the economic benefits are the fundamental incentives of the government and corporations. So therefore, at the end of the day, this money will not trickle down to the residents themselves. Ladies and gentlemen, now firstly, we don't think this is necessarily true because if the slums are actually being motivated or actually changing into making more infrastructure to make it safer, we think that becomes an incentive and a spark to make these people more industrial than ever. Now, what we think in team of opposition as a fundamental part, the fundamental problem of the slums itself, is that these people are not given proper infrastructure, not proper safety insurance, and not even proper policing. Yeah, police officers, right? Police, right? Police. Policing. Yeah, so if you actually make these people, some tourists, go into these slums, what we'll actually have things to do is make it safer and therefore allowing people, instead of just being so scared of gangs and staying at home, you'll be able to renovate and give them more leisure problems in order to industrialize their own problems and actually have self-interest to make things better. We think that has a fundamental benefit that we can actually have with corporations and government even having incentives to have their money. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, we think this is actually even better than what we have in the status quo. Because what Team Opposition told you is that their proposition policy against this is the alternative that, Western Portrayal, UNICEF, these pamphlets are actually sufficient enough to give them an image of what is happening in the status quo. We don't think that is true because in fact what the Western Portrayals are doing is simply saying that if you actually donate enough money to the slum tourists, if you actually just give money to the slum residents, then everything will be okay. Because that's exactly the fundamental problem of UNICEF, right? But before I rebut this argument, yes, ma'am.
So you say that slum tourism depicts the reality. So in Bronx, the drug sailors were depicted as the reality of Bronx, and people thought that there was misrepresentation, so it was bad. So what do you think about this?
We think that fundamentally, even if the government is inaccurately depicting the slums itself, what it's actually doing in that cause is making the slums safer for the people, allowing infrastructure to be instilled in the slums itself. We think that in itself allows the slums to be better for the residents as well. But let's move on to the rebuttal that I had against this idea about the Western Portrayal, right? We think the Western Portrayal is fundamentally flawed in a way that it forces people that money is simply the solution to everything. What Team Opposition wants to say against this argument is that actually no, what you actually have to do is give that political voice instead. And that can only happen with explicit one-to-one interaction with going into some slums and being slum tourists, right? We don't think statistics, we don't think photos, we don't think videos online will simply give you an actual view of what is happening. So let's move on to our third clash, which is about the residents of the slums. Now, firstly, the first argument that we've heard from Team Proposition was about how these people feel like animals. These people are being jeered upon. Now, what we think is that these people are being jeered upon is not because of slum tourists, it's because of people of sex tourists, right? These people that are fundamentally of different interests. But that is a completely irrelevant part of the debate, so we will not go into that area. But secondly, we think that these people will not feel like animals because what their fundamental motivation comes with the slum tourists is not that these people feel so discouraged and to be staying in their homes, but actually to clean up in front of their houses, to make the situations better so that more slum tourists will come in, right? Because that does give them economic benefits. We think that in itself is the policy and the theory that our second speaker has given to you about the broken window theory. Team Proposition was not able to refute this point at all. But secondly, they also told us about how this money will not be given to the residents actually. Two sets of reputations, right? Now firstly, we told you that some tourism corporations and the tourists, Team Opposition told you that these some tourists, corporations and tourists actually go into slums and actually do help them. We gave you many examples and leader of opposition and deputy leader of opposition about what is actually true. Team Population gave us no refutations on that. But secondly, all of my introduction has been devoted to about how exposure explicit to one-to-one interaction with slums would give them more political voice. Now, as a final conclusion of my speech, I want to tell you one thing. The team population rises under the fundamental assumption that the Western portrayal of people simply giving money and donating is the tangible benefit that these people can do. That is a tangible benefit. Team opposition says that, you know what, money is fine, money is great. However, what we really need in slums is not simply saying that, you know what, $5, what about $10? These things will solve everything, right? No, money will not solve everything, ladies and gentlemen. These people need political voice, more government, not negligence. Government going in and saying that, oh, there is a problem, you need to solve these problems. That is what we need. That is the most tangible benefit that we must give to slum residents. And because of those reasons, we're proud to oppose. Thank you.
All right, Hulk, go ahead. Speak.
You need a timer?
No, I got it. Alright, we're good.
I don't have a stopwatch.
Huh?
I don't have a stopwatch.
We're good. I'll take up 2 next time. So these people are not exposed, ladies and gentlemen, and no one has disagreed to this problem identification. Slums are slums because there is negligence about them and no one is willing to care. If there is one party that is willing to interact with these people, either out of community service or curiosity, it is those people who are going to put their feet in there, and those are the tourists, ladies and gentlemen. They're the only bridge connecting the outside world and slums. No one has denied that in this debate so far. However, just to ensure that these people have their privacy, just to ensure that these people can ensure their false conception of dignity, proposition would rather burn that bridge and continue that problem that slums are characterized by. Opposition would rather say that there are 2 things that we need to address. Number 1, would these people maintain slums? Would slums be intentionally maintained? The second, will dehumanization actually happen? To the first of all, about maintaining slums, there was a very convenient case shift made by the proposition throughout their cases. First, they state that slums are going to be cleaned up for it, and then they've relied on the characterization that slums are going to be portrayed worse than they actually are. Ladies and gentlemen, every single country has the incentive to develop an industry rather than rely on something that is destitute and dilapidated for their income. We all know that. We all know that rationally, countries would rather have a sustainable way of earning their money. We also know that countries are rather embarrassed by the existence of a slum. That was identified in our Leader of Opposition speech, that countries would rather hide this from view. If these countries have successfully hidden these slums from view, ladies and gentlemen, isn't exposure the key to doing this? Isn't maintaining slums not going to be an issue when people actually know what's going on? The way people know what's going on is through stimulation, ladies and gentlemen. Thousands of people are dying in Gaza. There are so many tragedies happening in this world, and yet no one in this room is crying. No one in this room is considering what's going on, what they can do to help the situations around the world. In the modern day, when information is so affluent, we are exposed to so many tragedies of an incredible scale that would have been imaginable in the ancient world and before times. Because of this, our senses are dulled. Our senses are dulled, and we can't recognize what the actual problem is. And they're saying that they would rather maintain the status quo when we hear that 1.4 million people are inhabiting slums in Africa, or more than that. That's just Kiruba, and over 3 million people in Asia are inhabiting the most dilapidated places on the planet. They would rather leave that be because of some false sense of privacy, because of some false sense of dignity. Whereas, ladies and gentlemen, what these people want is exposure. That leads us to the second point. What is real dehumanization? It's a clash between negligence and interaction. They try to package and sugarcoat their concept of negligence as leaving them be, laissez-faire, right? But that's not true. It's continuing the very characteristic that identified them as slums. In our first speech, we characterized, in our second speech, we continue that negligence and forgetfulness by the government, shutting them away and pushing them into a crack, is the reason slums are slums, not just regular poor areas. They admitted, the United Nations said that slums are unique and different areas. Why? Because the government doesn't care about them, and the only people willing to give them any attention will lose access to that slum. Whereas we said that although it might not save face for a select few individuals, we have recognized that they can welcome, some people welcome tourists, and this will eventually start some kind of autonomous development within the community, because people are interested in living better lives. People are interested in improving their current conditions, and that's no different from people in the slums. Interaction and exposure to the outside world is the only way that will solve this. Ultimately, our debate boils down to this. What will happen to the fat white guy who's well-fed in Indonesia sipping kopi luwak? Proposition would rather say that this guy would be much better off dropping a few quarters and dimes and nickels into the blue UNICEF box. We're saying that if he's already doing that, that's not enough. This guy needs to understand what's going on, and the only situation that will provide this is slum tourism. Exposure is the key, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
Opposition wants to debate this motion in a vacuum. Opp said that slums existing right now will be bettered when money and government attention is given to these areas, without recognizing the reality that slums change because of slums tourism, that government pressure to clear them out for city optics and market incentives to pressure them to actually be the worst slums possible change the very nature of slums, and therefore makes it fundamentally non-representative of the reality. Lauren thought this was a case shift, but it was actually two effects of these pressures introduced and incentives introduced by the market. First, market incentives nudge these slum dwellers to be the worst of the world. Second, government pressure leads to these people to slum clearances for better city optics, and that is not a case shift. Two questions. Number one, is slum tourism representative of reality? The bulk of their case relied upon this assumption. They said that exposure, social consensus, benefits. I'm going to tackle the two characteristics of them and show that this doesn't happen. First, exposure. They never grappled with the idea that this isn't true exposure, that this is pacified and sanitized version of the reality. And we didn't really hear a response other than Changyu saying that, well, it's still going to be better because these government attention is going to better and clear out and make it more clean. I'm going to deal with that later, but what we're fundamentally going to say here is that it's not the exposure to the real world that happens right now. Stitch pointed a very good reason why this is true. Two reasons, because there are inherent limits. Number one, the inherent time duration, in which people think poverty is something that you can escape and experience momentarily. That's simply not true. But also, that if you go there, you're actually harming these people, unlike donations of UNICEF, because you're actually introducing all the incentives and the power structures that change the slums into something that's worse. Second, the social consensus. I still don't know what that means. That simple soundbite and a buzzword doesn't mean anything to me. What's the extra social consensus than the already existing one, that poverty is bad and we need to fix it? It's actually organizations like UNICEF that make sure that we understand that poverty is something that should be fixed, and it should be fixed with structural methods, not simply benign hopes of experiencing these slums. Second question, are slums actually improved? Two reasons that they said it was yes. Number one, economic impact. Number two, government investment. First, economic impact. From the very get-go of today's debate, I told you that the money-making happens not within the slums, but outside of them, in the peripheries. Three parties that are going to make the money. Number one, governments through taxation and directly conducting these kind of tours. Secondly, professional tourism companies that build cable cars and actually, are foreign and outside these places. But thirdly, even if it's actually the slum dwellers, we said the people making the money are the young, wealthy, and young, healthy, and skilled. And these people will actually say, this is very important, and we told you that these people actually leave slums once they are granted the opportunity and capital to upward mobility, and therefore doesn't improve the problem that is slums in the first place. And we say that they said that education will happen because of all the good things of slum tourism companies. But that's a direct contradiction to the idea that Lauren pointed out, when Lauren said money is not going to solve all this problem, it's actually government intervention, and we don't think that's true. Second, government investment. It was naive for Changyu, Chan, and Lauren to believe that favelas are pacified, and that means a good thing. What it means is that the violence existing in the streets in Rio de Janeiro is saying that the government should stop carrying out the fucking World Cup and saying that they should take care about favelas and the real reality happening in these slums. Secondly, the unsanitary houses are residences of people who have nowhere else to go. Meaning that the clearances happening in Kenya and the favela means that all of the human rights violation is just worsening because you take away the only place that these people can live in the real world and in these countries, and that's a fundamental problem that we see on their side of the house. They seem to like the idea that governments can build roads and schools and improve the situation in these slums, and facilitate democracy. Two problems with that. Democracy isn't what we're talking about because the characterization I provided in the very beginning of this debate, I said it was about developing countries and has a weak democratic mandate. But secondly, if you want to build roads, if you want to build schools, that can happen. Why does it have to happen through the detour of slums and slum tourism rather than just giving that to the people because they need it, not because foreign tourists want it? For all those reasons, extremely proud to propose.